My name is Sloan. I am 33 years old and a forensic accountant. Last Thanksgiving, my brother slapped me across the face in front of our entire family because I accidentally made him drop a $200 bottle of wine. My mother demanded I apologize to him. My father silently opened the front door to throw me out into the freezing November rain. They called me the family screw-up who was living paycheck to paycheck and told me I was no longer welcome in my brother's $1.5 million home. I did not cry and I did not argue. I simply walked out. What none of them knew as they sat there eating pie under a crystal chandelier was that my brother did not own that house. I did. And by 9 o'clock the next morning, they would all be homeless. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. The air in the dining room of what was supposed to be Trent's sprawling suburban estate was thick with the smell of roasted turkey and the suffocating weight of my mother's expectations. We were gathered around a massive mahogany table that Trent bragged about importing from Italy. My brother Trent is 35 years old and has spent his entire adult life being worshipped as the golden child of our family. He wore a custom-tailored suit to a family dinner, acting as if he were hosting a corporate gala rather than a holiday meal. His wife Jasmine sat gracefully to his right. Jasmine is a brilliant architect, an elegant black woman who always treated me with a quiet warmth that the rest of my family severely lacked. She had spent the last 3 days decorating the house and preparing a beautiful meal, completely unaware of the massive web of financial lies her husband had spun around her. I had spent the afternoon keeping my head down and doing exactly what I was told to do. I was the designated kitchen help, the invisible scapegoat meant to serve the golden child. I walked out of the kitchen balancing a heavy crystal bowl of homemade cranberry sauce. The dining room was crowded with oversized furniture, and as I navigated past the chairs, my elbow barely brushed against Trent's shoulder. He was standing up to pour his second glass of a ridiculously expensive red wine. The impact was microscopic, but Trent reacted as if he had been shoved. The bottle slipped from his hand and crashed onto the hardwood floor. Dark red liquid splattered across the baseboards, and a few tiny drops landed on the cuff of his trousers. For a split second, nobody moved. I immediately set the bowl down and reached for a napkin. I opened my mouth to apologize, even though he had been standing in the walkway. But the words never made it out of my throat. Trent spun around, his face twisted in absolute rage. He did not yell. He did not groan about the mess. He raised his hand and slapped me squarely across the face. The sound cracked through the dining room like a gunshot. The physical force of the blow snapped my head to the side and sent a blinding flash of pain radiating through my jaw. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of the mahogany table to keep my balance. My cheek immediately began to burn. The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I tasted copper in my mouth. Trent stood over me, breathing heavily with his fists clenched at his sides. "Are you blind or just stupid?" he screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "This is why you will always be the family screw-up. Look at what you did. You are a clumsy disaster living paycheck to paycheck, and you come into my house and ruin my things." The sheer audacity of his words echoed in my mind. My house. He really believed his own lies. Before I could process the physical shock, Jasmine sprang out from her chair. Her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. "Trent, what is wrong with you?" she yelled, pushing past him to stand between us. Her eyes were wide with horror as she looked at my red, swelling cheek. "You do not ever put your hands on a woman. Have you lost your mind?" Jasmine reached out to check on me, her hands trembling with adrenaline and disbelief. She was the only person in that room who reacted with basic human decency. But her defense of me only enraged the real monster in the room. My mother, Patricia, slammed her wine glass down onto the table so hard the crystal stem nearly snapped. "Jasmine, sit down and stay out of this," she barked. Her voice was sharp and laced with the toxic authority she had wielded over us for decades. Patricia did not look at me with concern. She did not reprimand her 35-year-old son for physically assaulting his sister. Instead, she pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "Look what you did to his custom Italian suit, Sloane," she screeched. Her face was flushed with misplaced indignation. "You ruin every single holiday with your carelessness. You are always so jealous of your brother's success that you cannot even walk through his dining room without destroying something. Say you are sorry to your brother right now and get out of this house." I stood there, my hand still pressed against my throbbing cheek, staring at the woman who gave birth to me. She was looking at me with pure disgust. In her eyes, Trent could do no wrong. He was the successful executive with the perfect life, while I was just the struggling accountant who could not get anything right. She demanded I apologize to the man who had just struck me. I shifted my gaze to my father, Richard. He had been sitting at the head of the table carving the turkey when the slap happened. He still held the carving knife in his hand. "Dad," I said quietly, my voice trembling just a fraction. I was waiting for him to finally stand up to be a parent to protect his daughter, for once in his miserable life. Richard looked at my bruised face. Then he looked at Trent. Then he looked at my mother. He swallowed hard, carefully placed the carving knife down on the silver platter, and avoided my eyes completely. Without saying a single word, he stood up, walked down the long hallway, and pulled the heavy mahogany front door wide open. He was literally showing me the exit. The cold November wind howled into the foyer, carrying the freezing rain with it. He chose his golden child son and his tyrannical wife over my basic safety. The betrayal sliced deeper than the physical slap. It was a silent confirmation of what I had known my entire life. I was utterly alone in this family. Jasmine was visibly sickened. Her face contorted with disgust as she looked from my mother to my father and finally to the man she had married. She grabbed her purse from the back of her chair. "I am not staying here," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Sloane, I am leaving with you. I am driving you to the hospital." She took a step toward me, but Trent aggressively grabbed her arm. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into her expensive silk blouse. "You are not going anywhere, Jasmine," he hissed through gritted teeth. His mask of the perfect, charming husband had completely dissolved, revealing the controlling narcissist underneath. "We are sitting down and we are finishing dessert. Do not embarrass me in front of my parents. Do not make a scene." Jasmine stared at his hand on her arm, her expression transforming from shock to a chilling realization of who she was really married to. I caught her eye and gave her a very slight shake of my head. I did not want her getting hurt because of me. I lowered my hand from my cheek. I did not cry. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing my tears. I looked Trent dead in the eye and saw nothing but arrogant delusion. I looked at my mother, who was already busy dabbing at Trent's trousers with a wet cloth, whispering comforting words to her violent son. I walked down the hallway past my cowardly father, who could not even lift his head to look at me as I crossed the threshold. I stepped out into the freezing rain and pulled my coat tight around my shoulders. I walked to my car without making a single sound. The freezing November rain hit my face the second I stepped off the massive wrap-around porch. I did not look back at the heavy mahogany door. I did not wait for my father to realize what he had just done, or for my mother to come chasing after me. I knew they would not. I walked down the long paved driveway, feeling the sharp chill of the wind biting through my thin coat. The neighborhood was quiet and lined with perfectly manicured lawns and luxury cars parked in wide driveways. Inside that house, they were probably pouring fresh coffee and cutting the pumpkin pie, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just thrown their daughter out into the winter night. I reached my car parked at the very edge of the street because my mother had insisted I leave the prime spots for the more important guests. I unlocked the doors and slid into the driver's seat. The interior was freezing, but I did not turn the key in the ignition right away. I sat there in the dark and reached up to touch my face. My fingers grazed the swollen skin of my left cheek. It was hot to the touch and throbbing with a dull, heavy ache. I pulled down the sun visor and clicked on the small vanity mirror light. A thin line of blood was pooling at the corner of my mouth, where my teeth had caught the inside of my lip. I pulled a tissue from the center console and carefully wiped the blood away. I stared at my own reflection in the dim yellow light. Most people in my situation would be sobbing. They would be calling their best friend or pounding on the steering wheel in a fit of hysterical grief. But I did not shed a single tear. The sadness had been completely burned out of me years ago. In its place, there was only a cold and absolute clarity. My family had finally crossed the line of no return. I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed my leather work tote. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out my tablet. The screen illuminated the dark cabin of my car, casting a soft blue glow over my face. I did not open my text messages or my social media. I opened a highly secure legal portal. I typed in my complex password and waited for the two-factor authentication code to ping my phone. Once I was fully logged in, I navigated to a specific folder labeled under my private holding company, Sloan Financial Holdings Limited. My family thought I was a struggling junior accountant who could barely afford rent in a bad part of town. They loved the narrative that I was the poor and clumsy sister because it made my brother look like an absolute superstar by comparison. But they had absolutely no idea who I really was or what I had been quietly building for the last decade. I tapped the screen and opened a digitized property deed. The document clearly stated the legal ownership of the $1.5 million estate sitting just 50 yards away from my car. The owner listed was not my brother. It was my holding company. I bought this house in cash exactly 2 years ago. I scrolled to the next document in the file, which was a desperate email from Trent. 2 years ago, the golden child was secretly drowning in massive debt, trying to keep up the appearance of a wealthy executive. He had taken out massive loans and completely mismanaged his money. He had received a final foreclosure notice and was terrified that his wife and our parents would find out he was a total fraud. He came to my tiny apartment crying and begging me for help. He knew I was frugal and had savings, but he did not realize the true extent of my wealth. Because I still cared about him back then, I set up the limited liability company and bought the house from the bank just days before it went to public auction. I let him stay in the house under a very strict lease agreement. The rent was significantly lower than market value, just enough to cover the property taxes and basic maintenance. Trent swore to me that he would get his life together and pay me back every single dime. He promised he would tell our parents the truth about his financial failures. But of course he never did. The moment the crisis was averted, his arrogant mask slipped right back on. He told his beautiful wife Jasmine that he had purchased the house outright with a massive corporate bonus. He bragged to our mother and father about his incredible real estate investment. And worst of all, he stopped paying the secret rent almost immediately. He missed the first payment, then the second. For 6 months, he has not paid me a single dollar. Instead, he spent his money on custom Italian suits, expensive wine, and lavish kitchen renovations to impress his friends. I had been holding on to the legal eviction notices for half a year, giving him chance after chance to do the right thing. I had let my mother constantly belittle me in that very house, swallowing my pride to protect his fragile ego. But tonight he put his hands on me. He struck me across the face, and my parents cheered him on. The lease agreement contained a specific standard legal clause regarding violent behavior on the premises. Assaulting the landlord was an immediate non-negotiable violation that voided all standard grace periods. I looked at the eviction document glowing on my screen. I looked up through the windshield at the brightly lit dining room window. I pressed my finger against the digital execute button and submitted the filing directly into the county system. There was no turning back now. Their perfect world was about to end. It was exactly 12:30 in the morning when I finally pulled into the secured underground parking garage of my building. I parked my car in my reserved spot and took the private elevator all the way up to the top floor. When the polished steel doors opened, I stepped directly into my home. My family firmly believed that I lived in a cramped, run-down studio apartment on the wrong side of the city. They pictured me eating cheap ramen noodles and struggling to keep the lights on. My mother used to tell her country club friends that I was just going through a delayed coming-of-age phase and that my tiny apartment was a reflection of my lack of ambition. The reality was that I owned a sprawling 3,000-square-foot luxury penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire downtown skyline. The city lights sparkled below me like scattered diamonds, but I did not stop to admire the view tonight. I walked straight past my custom velvet sectional sofa and the imported marble kitchen island. I dropped my keys on the console table and went directly into my home office. The room was soundproofed and equipped with a multi-monitor workstation that rivaled most corporate trading floors. This was the command center where I had quietly built my real estate portfolio over the last decade, while my family was busy treating me like a charity case. I turned on the lights and sat down in my leather ergonomic chair. The lingering sting on my left cheek served as a physical reminder of why I was sitting here in the middle of the night. I woke up my computer monitors and opened the master financial ledger for my holding company. I brought up Trent's specific property file. For the past 6 months, I had watched his rental account balance sit at absolute zero. I had covered his property taxes, his homeowner association fees, and even the landscaping costs out of my own pocket, while he played the role of a self-made millionaire. He had taken advantage of my kindness for 2 years. He believed my silence was a sign of weakness. He confused my patience with submission. But tonight, he had violently crossed the line from a financial burden to a physical threat. I opened my legal software and began generating the documents that would completely dismantle the fabricated life he was so proud of. Normally, a standard eviction process in our state could take anywhere from 30 to 90 days. It usually required multiple notices, a court hearing, and a prolonged waiting period before any action could be taken. My brother was probably banking on that timeline, assuming that even if I tried to kick him out, he would have months to manipulate our parents into paying his legal fees or guilt-tripping me into dropping the case. But as a forensic accountant who specialized in high-stakes property acquisitions, I knew the municipal codes better than most real estate attorneys. I did not need 30 days. I navigated to a specific local ordinance regarding violent offenses committed on leased properties. According to the strict terms of our confidential rental agreement, any physical assault committed by the tenant against the landlord or property owner constituted an immediate and non-negotiable breach of contract. This specific clause completely bypassed the standard grace periods. Because Trent had struck me across the face in front of a dozen witnesses, including his own wife, I had the legal grounds to file an emergency 24-hour vacate order. I methodically filled out the digital forms, inputting the dates of his missed rent payments and attaching a sworn affidavit regarding the physical assault that had just taken place in the dining room. I typed out every detail with cold precision. I felt absolutely no guilt. The protective sister who had bought that house to save him from bankruptcy was gone. She had died the moment his hand struck her face, while their parents watched in silent approval. I compiled the documents into a single secure encrypted file. I picked up my phone and opened a secure messaging application to contact my property manager. His name was David, and he was a former military police officer who handled the most difficult situations for my real estate firm. He was ruthless, efficient, and incredibly loyal to me. I knew he was awake because we often handled international property transfers at odd hours. I sent him the encrypted file and typed a brief direct message. I told him that the tenant at the suburban estate was officially in severe default and had committed a violent physical assault against me earlier that evening. I instructed David to file the emergency vacate order with the county clerk's automated system immediately. I told him to contact his connections at the local sheriff's precinct and secure a civil standby escort for an eviction execution first thing in the morning. David replied less than a minute later. His message was brief, confirming that he had received the file and that the local authorities would be briefed on the violent nature of the tenant. He assured me that two armed deputies would be standing on my brother's front porch at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning to serve the notice and enforce the removal. Everything was locked into place. The trap had been set, and there was absolutely nothing my brother could do to stop it. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. The digital clock on my desk glowed brightly, showing it was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. Just as I reached out to turn off my monitors, my cell phone vibrated violently against the glass surface of my desk. The screen lit up, displaying a new text message from my mother, Patricia. I picked up the phone and read her words. She wrote, "Do not bother coming to Christmas either until you reimburse Trent for the ruined wine and apologize to the entire family for your embarrassing behavior tonight." I stared at the glowing text message for several long moments. A bitter laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the quiet of my office. Even after watching her grown son physically assault her daughter, her only concern was the price of the wine and the preservation of her perfect holiday image. She was demanding an apology from the victim while fiercely protecting the abuser. I did not type out an angry paragraph defending myself. I did not try to explain anything. I simply tapped the screen and blocked her number permanently. I did the same for my father and brother. Severing their access to me felt incredible. I set my phone face down on the desk. I stood up and walked into my custom climate-controlled wine cellar. I bypassed the everyday bottles and selected a rare vintage red from a private vineyard in France. It cost 5 times more than the one Trent dropped. I poured the rich dark liquid into a crystal glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. It tasted exactly like absolute freedom. With Trent's eviction officially processed and scheduled for the morning, my focus shifted to the two people who had stood by and watched him strike me: my mother and father. For my entire life, I had been told to respect my parents because they had sacrificed so much to give us a good life in a wealthy suburb. But the truth was, their wealth had been a carefully constructed illusion for the past 10 years. When my father retired, his investments collapsed. He had made terrible financial decisions trying to keep up with the millionaires at his country club. Instead of downsizing and admitting they were struggling, my parents turned to me. They did not ask Trent for help because they could never bear to burden their golden child. They assumed my quiet, frugal lifestyle meant I had spare cash. They did not know I was building a massive real estate portfolio. They just knew I was responsible. So I stepped in and quietly kept them afloat. I paid their property taxes. I covered their insurance premiums. I did it because I believed that is what a good daughter does. But tonight, they had shown me exactly what my loyalty meant to them. It meant absolutely nothing. When the choice was between my physical safety and Trent's ego, they chose him without a second's hesitation. I opened a new tab on my computer and logged into my primary banking portal. I navigated to the authorized users section of my Platinum credit card account. 5 years ago, my mother had called me crying about a medical emergency. She begged me to give her a card for her pharmacy copays and doctor visits. I agreed and added her as an authorized user on an account with a massive credit limit. Of course, the medical emergencies magically disappeared within a few months. But my mother never stopped using the card. She called it her emergency safety net, but her definition of an emergency was absolutely ridiculous. I pulled up her recent statement history and scrolled through the charges. There were $1,000 charges at the country club dining room, where she hosted weekly lunches for her friends to brag about Trent's fake promotions. There were massive bills from luxury department stores. Just last week, she had spent $3,000 on a custom espresso machine, and the shipping address for that machine was Trent's house. She was using my money to buy lavish gifts for the brother who had just assaulted me. She was funding her entire social life on my dime while telling those exact same friends that I was a bitter, lonely woman who refused to wear makeup or buy nice clothes. She was literally swiping my card to maintain the very social status she used to look down on me. I stared at the screen, watching the little cursor blink next to her name. Patricia. I thought about the way she pointed her finger at me tonight, screeching about how I ruined another holiday. I thought about how she rushed to comfort Trent after he hit me, treating him like the victim. A deep sense of peace washed over me. I did not feel angry anymore. I just felt completely detached. I clicked the button to manage authorized users. A warning prompt popped up asking if I was sure I wanted to permanently remove this user and cancel their physical card. I did not hesitate. I clicked confirm. The system refreshed and her name vanished from the account. The platinum card sitting in her designer wallet right now was officially just a useless piece of plastic. The next time she tried to buy a round of drinks at the country club or purchase another ridiculous gift for her abusive son, her card would decline. The humiliation she was so desperate to avoid was going to hit her in the most public way possible. With my mother completely cut off, I turned my attention to the man who had silently opened the front door and thrown me out into the cold. My father, Richard. He was a man who cared about nothing more than his image. His entire identity was tied to the luxury car he drove around town. 3 years ago, his ancient sedan finally broke down. He tried to lease a brand new luxury sport utility vehicle, but his credit score was completely ruined from years of hidden debt. The dealership laughed him out of the showroom. Once again, he came to me. He promised he would make the monthly payments if I just co-signed the lease. But I knew better than to co-sign and link my pristine credit to his disastrous financial history. Instead, I leased the vehicle entirely in my name and under my own corporate account. I let him drive it as long as he deposited the monthly payment into my checking account. Naturally, he stopped making those deposits over a year ago. I had been paying $900 a month for the car he drove to the golf course every single day. I had let it slide because I pitied him. I thought he was just a sad old man trying to hold on to his dignity. But tonight I saw exactly who he was. He was a coward. He was a man who would watch his daughter get struck in the face and then punish her for it. I opened another window and logged directly into the automotive financing portal. I brought up the account details for the sleek black vehicle currently parked in the driveway of the house Trent did not own. The account was in perfect standing because I had never missed a single payment. I navigated to the lease management options. I canceled the automatic monthly bank transfer. Then I opened a separate communication window with the dealership and the affiliated repossession agency. Because the vehicle was a corporate lease and fully under my name, I had the absolute legal right to terminate the use agreement and surrender the vehicle at any time. I filled out a digital authorization form declaring that the vehicle was no longer authorized for use by the current driver and requested an immediate voluntary repossession. I typed in the exact address of Trent's house and noted that the keys were likely inside the property, but the vehicle was parked outside in the open driveway. I digitally signed the document and submitted the request. The agency guaranteed a pickup within 12 hours. I checked the time. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. Outside my penthouse windows, the city was completely silent. But inside my home office, I had just orchestrated the total destruction of my family's financial reality. The traps were fully set, and there was no going back. The emergency eviction notice was officially filed with the local authorities. The limitless credit line was permanently severed. The luxury car was scheduled for immediate repossession. I closed my laptop and stood up from my desk. I finally walked to my bedroom knowing that when the sun came up, my family was going to wake up to a nightmare they could never escape. The sun rose on Black Friday morning, casting a bright, cold light over the sprawling suburban neighborhood. Inside the massive estate my brother claimed to own, the atmosphere was quiet and undisturbed. It was exactly 9 o'clock. Trent was awake and lounging in the massive gourmet kitchen. He wore an expensive silk robe and held a plate of leftover turkey. He felt absolutely invincible. In his mind, he had won the ultimate victory the night before. He successfully put his younger sister in her place, securing his position as the unquestionable ruler of our family. He believed I was sitting in my tiny apartment crying over my ruined relationship with our parents. He had no idea that while he slept in a master bedroom that legally belonged to me, I had completely dismantled the foundation of his fake wealthy life. He took a bite of food and looked out the large bay windows at the perfectly manicured lawn. He was living the American dream, but it was a dream built entirely on my money and my patience. Suddenly, a loud and aggressive pounding echoed through the grand foyer. It was not the polite knock of a delivery driver or a neighbor dropping off cookies. It was a heavy, authoritative strike that rattled the thick mahogany wood. Trent frowned and set his plate down on the marble kitchen island. He tightened the belt of his silk robe and walked slowly toward the front entrance. He was annoyed that anyone would dare to disturb his peaceful morning. He reached out and pulled the heavy door open, expecting to yell at a confused delivery person. Instead, he found himself standing face to face with two large uniformed deputies from the county sheriff's department. Their squad car was parked directly in his driveway, with its lights flashing silently. Standing on the sidewalk just behind them was David, my property manager, wearing a dark suit and holding a thick manila folder. "Good morning, sir," one of the deputies said, his voice firm and devoid of holiday cheer. "We are here to serve an emergency order to vacate the premises." Trent stared at them for a few seconds before a slow, arrogant smile spread across his face. He laughed out loud. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "This has to be some kind of ridiculous prank," he said, shaking his head. "Officers, I do not know who called you or what joke this is, but you have the wrong address. I own this house. My name is Trent, and I am a senior executive. Leave now before I call your captain to complain about this harassment." He reached out to push the door shut, but the lead deputy immediately planted a heavy black boot firmly against the threshold, stopping the door from closing. The officer's demeanor shifted from professional to stern. "Sir, this is not a joke, and you do not own this property," the deputy stated flatly. He reached into the manila folder that David had handed him earlier and pulled out the stack of legal documents I had generated at 1 o'clock in the morning. The deputy held the papers up directly in front of Trent's face. "We have a court-certified emergency eviction order filed by Sloan Financial Holdings Limited, the legal owner of this estate. You are listed here as a tenant in severe default of a residential lease agreement. Furthermore, this emergency order has been expedited due to a sworn affidavit detailing a violent physical assault committed by you on these premises last night." The arrogant smile completely vanished from Trent's face. His pale skin drained of all color as his eyes locked onto the name of my holding company, printed boldly at the top of the official document. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. "Wait," he stammered, taking a step backward. "That is my sister. This is a misunderstanding. She is just mad at me. We had a family argument last night. You cannot just kick a man out of his own home over a family argument. This is completely illegal. I am going to sue everyone involved in this." The second deputy stepped fully into the foyer, invading Trent's space and establishing complete control of the situation. "It is not illegal, sir. It is a binding court order," the deputy replied strictly. "The property owner has exercised her legal right to terminate your tenancy immediately due to violent conduct. You are currently trespassing. You have exactly 2 hours to gather your personal belongings and vacate this property. If you are still standing inside this house or on this property when that clock runs out, you will be placed in handcuffs and arrested for criminal trespassing. Do you understand these terms?" The sheer volume of the deputy's voice echoed up the grand staircase. The commotion was no longer contained to the front door. The heavy footsteps and the loud demands of the police officers shattered the peaceful morning throughout the rest of the house. Upstairs in the master suite, Jasmine had been woken up by the heavy pounding. She hurried down the sweeping staircase wearing a simple robe, her expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. She saw her husband standing in the foyer, looking small and terrified, while 2 armed police officers stood inside her home. At the exact same moment, the doors to the downstairs guest bedroom swung open. My mother, Patricia, and my father, Richard, stepped out into the hallway. They were still dressed in their luxurious sleepwear. Patricia gasped loudly, pressing a hand to her chest as she saw the flashing lights of the police cruiser shining through the large front windows. "What is going on here?" Patricia shrieked, rushing forward. "Trent, what did you do? Why are police in our house?" Richard trailed behind her, looking completely bewildered. Trent could not even look his mother in the eye. He was holding the legal documents with trembling hands, his perfect facade cracking into a million tiny pieces. Jasmine walked slowly toward the front door, her sharp eyes analyzing the situation instantly. She did not panic like my mother. She looked at the police officers, and then she looked at the papers shaking in Trent's hands. "Officer, what exactly does that document say?" Jasmine asked, her voice dangerously calm. The lead deputy turned to her, assuming she was another tenant. "Ma'am, this is an emergency order to vacate. The tenant here is 6 months behind on rent and committed an assault on the landlord. You have 2 hours to pack your things and leave the premises." The words hung in the air like a heavy, toxic cloud. 6 months behind on rent. Violent assault on the landlord. Jasmine stared at the man she had married. My mother stopped screaming and just stood there frozen in pure shock. My father looked like he was about to collapse. The absolute certainty of their perfect, wealthy life had just been ripped away from them before they even finished their morning coffee. The harsh reality was finally here. The countdown had officially started, and my brother had nowhere left to hide. The heavy silence in the grand foyer was completely suffocating. The two armed police officers stood perfectly still, waiting patiently, as they wanted my brother to process his absolute grim reality. But it was Jasmine who deliberately chose to move first. She stood near the bottom of the grand wooden staircase while wearing her silk morning robe over her pajamas. Her bare feet pressed firmly against the cold marble floor. Her sharp and meticulous mind made her a brilliant architect, and she was already analyzing the chaotic situation at lightning speed. She did not scream or faint or shed any tears. Instead, a terrifying calm slowly washed over her elegant features as she walked slowly and purposefully straight toward her terrified husband. The man she had deeply loved and completely trusted forever, the man who confidently promised her a lifetime of security, was currently trembling like a terrified child cornered suddenly. His knuckles were white, gripping the official legal papers. Jasmine stopped right in front of him without any hesitation. She absolutely did not ask for his permission to look, before she reached out and snatched the thick manila folder, aggressively pulling the eviction document straight from his shaking hands. Trent let out a pathetic gasp, trying to pull back, but he was completely powerless against her determined iron grip. Jasmine flipped past the generic cover sheet with ruthless efficiency because, as a highly educated architect, she dealt with complex documents, reading property deeds and local zoning permits every day. She knew exactly what a legitimate legal eviction notice meant, and she knew precisely how to read the hidden fine print. Her dark eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, searching quickly before she saw the section detailing 6 months of unpaid rent. She saw the paragraph describing the violent physical assault recently, but the piece of information that finally stopped her breathing was resting perfectly at the top of the page. Right there, printed in bold black ink, was the owner, which did not say Trent's name as the legal owner. It did not say a random corporate bank or lender. It clearly said Sloan Financial Holdings Limited in bold letters. The massive realization hit her with the destructive force that felt like being struck by a freight train. The scattered dots connected instantly in her brilliant analytical mind, highlighting all the times Trent had nervously avoided talking about mortgages, all the times he aggressively intercepted the daily delivered mail, and all the times he arrogantly belittled me for being poor. It was all a massive calculated lie designed to manipulate, because I was not the poor sister begging for any scraps. I was the wealthy landlord holding the keys to everything, and her supposedly successful husband was a complete financial fraud. Jasmine lowered the legal papers slowly, keeping her posture straight. Her hands were no longer shaking with sudden adrenaline rushes when she looked up and locked her piercing eyes with him. The stale air in the room grew incredibly dense now as she whispered, "You told me you bought this place outright." She spoke with her voice dangerously low and perfectly steady, while her sharp words cut through the grand foyer like knives. "You told me you used your corporate bonus to buy, and you sat across from me at a romantic dinner. You looked me dead in the eye and told lies, swearing you owned this luxury estate free and clear. Trent swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in fear as he stammered, taking a step. He held his hands raised in a pathetic, useless plea. It is very complicated and incredibly hard to understand clearly, but I can explain everything to you if you just wait. I just needed a little bit of extra time today because I wanted to sort things out at the corporate office. But Jasmine was absolutely not listening to his pathetic, empty excuses as the full crushing weight of his ultimate financial betrayal hit violently, crashing down squarely onto her tense shoulders. We just spent exactly $50,000 renovating the gourmet kitchen, she yelled, her perfect composure finally cracking under the pressure. The sheer magnitude of his deception took permanent hold now, because that was exactly $50,000 of my personal savings account money I earned long before our tragic marriage. You let me drain my own secure bank account completely to make me upgrade a house you do not own, letting me invest my money into a fake property. It actually belongs to your sister, who you assaulted yesterday, and you are completely broke, always lying, constantly deceiving me since the day we met. Trent had absolutely no valid defense to offer her today, leaving his mouth hanging wide open, but unfortunately, no coherent words came out. He looked over to his parents for immediate rescue help, looking like a helpless little boy caught stealing candy. And right on cue, my toxic mother, Patricia, rushed forward, wanting to fiercely protect her precious spoiled golden child, saving him from facing any real consequences. She completely ignored the devastating proven fact that he lied, and her beloved son was a broke, manipulative, pathetic fake man who had just defrauded his own smart wife, completely stealing $50,000 directly from her savings account. Instead, Patricia focused all of her endless toxic energy elsewhere, turning toward the easiest target in the room, me. Jasmine. You need to calm down right now, Patricia commanded, stepping aggressively between them, waving her manicured hands frantically. This is absolutely not the appropriate time to attack him, and you should never publicly embarrass your husband in front of strangers, because Trent is under an enormous amount of corporate pressure currently. He simply made a tiny, harmless mistake regarding the stupid paperwork, and we need to focus all our attention on the problem. This whole situation is completely Sloane's fault, and nobody else's, since this eviction is just an illegal, childish stunt pulled today by her. It is orchestrated by a bitter, jealous girl seeking revenge because she wants to selfishly ruin our beautiful family holiday. We need to call a powerful lawyer immediately right now, and we must have Sloane arrested for filing completely fraudulent reports, since we absolutely cannot let her do this terrible thing today. Jasmine slowly turned her head and looked directly at Patricia, while the sheer delusion and the toxic gaslighting radiating from her was almost physically repulsive to witness in real time. For years, Jasmine had tried so hard to be perfect, wanting to be the perfect supportive daughter-in-law. She had politely endured Patricia's constant passive-aggressive nasty comments while enduring her endless desperate need for total family control. She had blindly believed the false narrative that Trent succeeded, thinking he was the highly successful hero of everyone, and she thought I was just the deeply troubled family burden. But in that exact moment, standing in the grand foyer with the armed police waiting patiently by the front door, the entire grand illusion shattered completely and forever. She saw my mother for exactly what she truly was, a narcissistic enabler, always destroying lives just to protect her son. The chaotic reality of the grand foyer was entirely too much for my mother Patricia to handle. She absolutely despised anything that shattered her carefully curated image of upper-class perfection. The sight of two armed county sheriffs standing on the imported marble floor of her son's house was completely unacceptable to her. Instead of demanding the truth from Trent or comforting Jasmine, my mother immediately shifted into her default mode of operation, which was aggressive denial. She turned her back on the police officers and pulled out her designer smartphone. Her manicured fingers were shaking slightly, but she kept her posture completely rigid. She loudly announced to the entire room that this was nothing more than a ridiculous administrative error, and she absolutely refused to stand in a house occupied by police officers. She declared that she was going to book the presidential suite at the downtown Plaza Hotel so the family could relax and enjoy their holiday weekend, while Trent's lawyers sorted out what she called my illegal and vindictive stunt. She wanted to project total control. She wanted Jasmine to see that the family was still wealthy and powerful. She was serious. Patricia dialed the number for the most expensive luxury hotel in the city. She placed the phone on speaker so everyone in the foyer could hear her exert her financial dominance. A polite concierge answered the call, greeting her warmly. Patricia used her most condescending aristocratic voice to demand their finest available suite for the entire weekend. She casually mentioned that they would need room service ready upon arrival and full access to the luxury spa amenities. The concierge confirmed that the requested suite was indeed available for $1,200 a night. Patricia smiled smugly, looking over at Jasmine and Trent as if she had just saved the day. She pulled her sleek heavy metal credit card from her expensive leather wallet. It was the exact same platinum card I had permanently deactivated just 7 hours prior. She confidently read the 16-digit number aloud, reciting the expiration date and the security code with practiced ease. The concierge asked her to hold for just a brief moment while the system processed the transaction. The foyer was completely silent except for the soft hold music playing from Patricia's phone. The police officers simply watched her with stoic expressions. After a long minute, the concierge returned to the line. His voice was noticeably tighter and far less enthusiastic. He politely informed my mother that the card had been declined. Patricia scoffed loudly, waving her hand in the air, as if the concierge could actually see her. She confidently declared that their hotel payment system must be malfunctioning because there was absolutely no spending limit on her exclusive platinum card. She demanded that he run the numbers again immediately and suggested he manually override the frustrating system error. The concierge maintained his professional tone, but clearly stated that he had already attempted the transaction twice, and the banking institution had returned a hard decline, indicating the account was either closed or entirely frozen. He gently asked if she had another form of payment. Patricia's smug smile completely vanished. The color drained from her perfectly powdered face. She ended the call abruptly without saying another single word. The heavy metal card suddenly looked like a useless piece of garbage in her trembling hand. She stared at it in absolute disbelief. For the first time in 10 years, she had no access to my money. She had no safety net whatsoever. She looked at Trent, who was still staring at the floor, unable to offer any help. She was completely stranded, and the crushing reality of her financial ruin was beginning to suffocate her. While my mother was paralyzed by her declined credit card, my father Richard was desperately trying to avoid looking at the police officers. He was a deeply cowardly man who hated confrontation and public humiliation more than anything else in the world. He slowly wandered away from the center of the foyer and stepped toward the massive front bay windows. He stared out at the cold morning, trying to figure out how he was going to escape this absolute nightmare. His eyes scanned the perfectly manicured lawn and the wide paved driveway. Suddenly, his breath hitched in his throat. Backing slowly into the driveway with its yellow lights flashing was a heavy-duty commercial tow truck. Richard pressed his face against the cold glass of the window, completely unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The tow truck was not there for the police cruisers. It was backing up directly toward his pristine black luxury sport utility vehicle. This was the car he drove to the country club every single day. This was the ultimate symbol of his fabricated success and his entire social identity. He watched in pure horror as the tow truck driver hopped out of the cab and began unraveling the heavy metal winch cables. Richard did not bother to put on his winter coat or change his shoes. He practically sprinted out the front door, pushing past the armed deputies and running out into the freezing November wind, wearing only his thin silk pajamas and his leather house slippers. "Hey, what are you doing?" he screamed, waving his arms frantically as he ran down the long driveway. "Get your dirty hands off my car right now!" The tow truck driver did not even flinch. He was a large, bearded man wearing a heavy canvas jacket, and he calmly continued securing the thick metal hooks beneath the front chassis of the luxury vehicle. Richard reached the truck panting heavily and completely out of breath. He pointed a trembling finger at the driver, demanding that he release the expensive car immediately or face severe legal consequences. The driver finished tightening the heavy straps and stood up, wiping the thick black grease from his hands onto a dark rag. He looked at my frantic father with a mixture of annoyance and complete apathy. He reached into the front pocket of his heavy jacket and pulled out a folded piece of yellow carbon copy paper. He shoved the printed paper directly into Richard's chest. "I am just doing my job, buddy," the driver said loudly. "This vehicle is officially marked for repossession by the primary leaseholder." Richard unfolded the yellow paper with shaking hands. His eyes darted across the printed words. He saw the exact same name printed on the eviction notice inside: Sloan Financial Holdings Limited. The document clearly stated that the corporate lease had been terminated by the account holder and the vehicle surrendered immediately. The driver climbed into his truck and engaged the hydraulic lift. Richard stood shivering, entirely helpless as the front wheels were lifted off the ground. He turned around, looking back at the open door. Inside, he saw my mother holding her useless declined card. My father finally understood the absolute magnitude of their total loss. The expensive props they used to pretend they were superior had been completely stripped away. They were officially completely stranded, entirely broke, and getting kicked onto the freezing winter street with nothing left. The shock of the towed car pushed my mother over the edge. Patricia stood in the grand foyer, completely enraged. Her perfect holiday morning was destroyed, and she desperately needed someone to punish. Since her husband was entirely useless, and her golden child son was currently a complete failure, she directed all of her toxic fury directly at me. She turned to Trent, who was still clutching the eviction notice, and demanded he order an expensive luxury car service immediately. She insisted on an Uber Black because even in the middle of a massive financial crisis, she absolutely refused to be seen riding in a standard vehicle. Trent pulled out his phone and ordered the car using an old business account he still had access to. Patricia announced to the room that they were going directly to my accounting firm in the downtown financial district. She wanted to ambush me at my workplace. She firmly believed I was just a miserable junior clerk, sitting in a tiny gray cubicle. Her master plan was to march right up to my supervisor and demand that I be fired for harassing her family. She was convinced that the threat of losing my supposedly low-paying job would force me to cancel the eviction and beg for her forgiveness. She had always used financial intimidation to control people, and she thought I was still the same scared little girl who desperately needed a paycheck to survive. While my mother ranted about getting me fired, Jasmine was quietly moving through the house with absolute purpose. Patricia yelled up the grand staircase, telling Jasmine to get dressed and come with them to confront me. Jasmine did not even bother to answer. Instead, she walked down the stairs carrying a large designer suitcase she had quickly packed. She had traded her silk morning robe for a sharp tailored winter coat and comfortable boots. The terrified look she had earlier was completely gone. In its place was a terrifyingly calm demeanor. Trent rushed over to her, trying to block the front door. He begged her to stay and wait for him to fix this massive misunderstanding. Jasmine looked at him with an expression of pure disgust. She told him there was absolutely nothing left to fix. She stated that she was going to stay with her parents in the city, and she advised him not to call her. Trent tried to grab her suitcase, but she stepped around him with elegant grace. She walked out the front door right past the armed police officers and began walking down the sidewalk to call her own ride. She was completely done with his lies, and she was walking away from the toxic nightmare without a single tear. Her departure left Trent standing in the foyer looking like a completely broken man. A few minutes later, a sleek black luxury suburban pulled into the driveway, carefully avoiding the police cruisers. Patricia, Richard, and Trent climbed into the back seats in absolute silence. As the heavy doors closed, the reality of their situation began to set in. But instead of reflecting on their own massive failures, they spent the entire 30-minute drive plotting my total destruction. Patricia leaned forward in her leather seat and started detailing exactly how she was going to humiliate me. She told Trent that they needed to make a massive public scene in front of all my coworkers. She wanted everyone in my office to know that I was a terrible, ungrateful daughter who was trying to ruin her brother's perfect life. Richard chimed in, agreeing with her toxic plan. He said I needed to be taught a severe lesson about family loyalty. He was still furious about his luxury sport utility vehicle being towed away, and he blamed me entirely for his public embarrassment. He completely ignored the fact that I had paid for his car for over a year, while he contributed absolutely nothing. They fed off each other's delusions, creating a completely false narrative where they were the innocent victims and I was a crazy, vindictive villain who needed to be put in my place. They convinced themselves I had broken the law to serve the eviction notice. Patricia even drafted a fake email in her head to send to my corporate human resources department, hoping to permanently destroy my future career prospects. The luxury car merged onto the busy highway, heading straight toward the towering glass buildings of the downtown financial district. Trent stared out the tinted window, trying to rebuild his shattered ego. He told our parents that my company was just a mid-level accounting firm and that my boss would definitely fire me to avoid any corporate scandal. He pictured me sitting at a cheap laminate desk, drowning in paperwork and terrified of management. None of them had ever bothered to visit my office or ask about my actual career. Whenever I tried to talk about my promotions at family dinners, they would intentionally change the subject to brag about Trent's latest fake corporate achievement. They assumed my job was completely insignificant because they viewed me as an insignificant person. As the heavy black vehicle pulled off the highway and navigated the crowded city streets, the tension inside the cabin grew thicker. They were practically vibrating with aggressive energy, ready to barge into a miserable cubicle farm and destroy my life. They had absolutely no idea that they were driving straight into a massive trap. They were completely underestimating the monster they had carelessly awakened. They were about to walk into my empire thinking they held all the power, but they were truly walking right into their own ultimate corporate slaughter. They expected to find a weak, frightened girl who would instantly crumble under their intense family pressure. Instead, they were actually about to meet the incredibly wealthy and powerful chief executive officer who was fully prepared to finally finish the job they started last night at the dinner table. The heavy glass doors of the towering downtown high-rise slid open and my family walked into the massive lobby of my corporate headquarters. They had spent the entire car ride convincing themselves that they were about to walk into a depressing gray office building filled with cheap carpet and fluorescent lights. They fully expected to find me sitting in a tiny cubicle, buried under piles of boring paperwork, and terrified of my middle management boss. Instead, they found themselves standing in a breathtaking, ultra-modern architectural masterpiece. The floors were polished Italian marble that reflected the warm, recessed lighting perfectly. Massive abstract sculptures decorated the expansive waiting area, and sharply dressed professionals walked briskly past them holding expensive leather briefcases. It was the absolute pinnacle of corporate wealth and success. My father, Richard, nervously adjusted the collar of his shirt, suddenly feeling extremely out of place in his hastily thrown-on jacket and casual slacks. Trent looked around the luxurious space with a mixture of deep envy and total confusion. This was exactly the kind of building he always pretended to work in, but he actually worked in a much older and far less impressive suburban office park. However, my mother, Patricia, was completely blind to the intimidating environment around her. She was far too fueled by her toxic rage to notice that she was entirely out of her league. Patricia marched confidently across the vast marble floor, the sharp clicks of her designer heels echoing loudly in the quiet professional space. She headed straight for the massive curved reception desk, where a highly polished executive assistant was typing away at a sleek computer terminal. My mother slammed her hand flat onto the polished stone surface to demand immediate attention. The receptionist looked up with a perfectly trained professional smile, waiting politely for Patricia to speak. "I am here to see a junior accountant named Sloane," my mother demanded, using her loudest, most condescending tone of voice. She wanted to make sure that anyone walking through the lobby would hear her completely humiliate me. "I need to speak with her direct supervisor or the human resources manager immediately. She has been harassing my family and orchestrating illegal activities on company time. I demand that she be brought down here right now so I can personally see her fired for her absolutely unacceptable behavior today." Trent stepped up right behind our mother, crossing his arms over his chest and nodding in agreement. He looked incredibly smug, fully believing that his nightmare was finally about to end, and that he was going to watch his younger sister lose her sole source of income. The receptionist blinked slowly, her perfectly manicured hands resting quietly on her keyboard. She looked at Patricia and then shifted her gaze to Trent and Richard, who were standing behind her looking like an angry mob. The professional smile faded from the receptionist's face and was quickly replaced by a look of profound confusion mixed with deep, genuine pity. She slowly tilted her head, studying my mother as if she had just spoken an entirely different language. "Ma'am," the receptionist said, her voice calm but echoing clearly across the quiet marble lobby. "I am not quite sure I understand what you are asking for right now. There is no junior accountant named Sloane working anywhere in this building." Patricia scoffed loudly, throwing her hands up in the air in pure dramatic frustration. "Do not lie to me, young lady," Patricia snapped, leaning over the desk aggressively. "I know exactly where my daughter works. She has been doing basic tax returns here for years. Find her manager right this instant." The receptionist did not flinch. She maintained her steady eye contact with my mother and delivered the devastating truth with absolute precision. "Mom," the receptionist repeated slowly and clearly so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. "Sloane is not a junior accountant, and she does not have a manager. Sloane is the chief executive officer and the primary founder of this entire financial firm. In fact, she owns this entire building. You are currently standing inside her private corporate headquarters." The words hung in the empty air like a physical shock wave, completely shattering the pathetic illusion my family had spent years maintaining. The blood instantly drained from Trent's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His arms dropped slowly to his sides as the reality of my true power crashed down upon him. He suddenly realized that the woman he had slapped last night, the woman he had called a clumsy, broke failure, was actually a massive corporate titan who could completely crush him with a single phone call. Richard took 2 heavy steps backward, literally staggering as if he had been punched in the chest. His luxury car was gone, and now he was standing inside a skyscraper, owned by the daughter he had thrown out into the freezing rain. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but absolutely no sound came out. She was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her own humiliating miscalculation. Before she could recover from the shock, 2 massive security guards materialized from the shadows of the lobby. They were incredibly tall men, wearing sharp dark suits and discreet earpieces. They immediately flanked my family, stepping close enough to be physically intimidating without making contact. The lead guard sternly instructed them to step away from the desk and prepare to be escorted off the private premises immediately. Patricia finally found her voice and began to shrill about her rights, but her panic was instantly silenced. A soft chime echoed through the lobby speakers, followed by my calm and icy voice crackling over the intercom system. "Let them stay," I said, my voice projecting total authority from the top floor of the building. "Send them up to my office right now." The guards nodded silently and pointed toward the private executive elevator waiting to deliver my family directly into their ultimate nightmare. The heavy executive elevator doors closed smoothly, sealing my family inside with the 2 massive security guards. The high-speed elevator ascended rapidly, pulling them all the way up to the top floor of the skyscraper. When the doors finally opened, they were guided down a wide corridor lined with expensive modern art and plush imported carpets. The guards directed them toward double-glass doors at the very end of the hall. The doors swung open to reveal my private corner office. It was a massive space wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire downtown city skyline. The morning sunlight poured into the room, highlighting the polished concrete floors and the minimalist designer furniture. I was sitting comfortably behind a massive custom-made tempered glass desk. I was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal gray blazer and a crisp white silk blouse. My hair was pulled back into a sharp professional style. I did not look like the scared little sister they had bullied last night. I looked exactly like what I was, which was a highly successful corporate titan who held their entire future in the palm of her hands. I did not show any anger or resentment. I simply radiated pure ice and absolute control. My mother Patricia walked into the room and immediately reverted to her deeply ingrained narcissistic habits. The sheer intimidation of my office did not humble her at all because her delusion was far too strong. She completely ignored the breathtaking view and the obvious signs of my immense wealth. She marched right up to the edge of my glass desk, her face twisted in a mask of pure toxic fury. She pointed her finger at me just like she had done in the dining room the night before. Sloan. You will call those police officers right this instant and cancel that ridiculous fake eviction order, she screamed, her voice echoing harshly against the glass walls. I do not care what kind of little accounting scam you are running here to get this office. You are going to pick up your phone and fix this massive mistake immediately. You have completely ruined our holiday morning and embarrassed your brother in front of his neighbors. You are going to apologize to Trent right now, and you are going to pay for the hotel room we had to book because of your childish temper tantrum. Richard stood slightly behind her, nodding his head in silent agreement, but keeping his distance. He was still wearing his silk pajamas and his leather house slippers, looking absolutely pathetic in a corporate executive office. Trent stood next to our mother, crossing his arms defensively, trying to regain some fraction of his shattered ego. He still believed that our mother could bully me into submission, just like she had always done throughout our entire childhood. I did not interrupt her unhinged rant. I let her scream and demand and threaten, while the two security guards stood silently by the door watching her completely embarrass herself. I did not blink, and my expression remained completely neutral. When she finally ran out of breath and stopped yelling, the silence in the room was incredibly heavy. I still did not say a single word to her. I did not need to justify my actions or explain my success. Instead, I slowly reached into the sleek leather briefcase resting on the floor beside my chair. I pulled out a thick, heavy red folder. This was not a standard corporate file. It was the comprehensive forensic audit I had compiled over the last 3 years, documenting every single lie, every stolen dollar, and every forged signature my golden child brother had ever created. I placed the red folder on the smooth glass surface of my desk. I placed my hand flat on top of it and slowly pushed it across the transparent desk, directly toward Trent. Trent's arrogant posture instantly collapsed the moment his eyes locked onto the bright red cover of the folder. He recognized it immediately because he had seen a very similar file on his own desk years ago, before his former company quietly fired him for severe financial misconduct. He knew exactly what kind of documents an investigative forensic accountant would keep inside a restricted red file. The color completely drained from his face, and a look of sheer primitive panic overtook him. All of his carefully constructed lies about his massive corporate bonuses and his brilliant investments were sitting inside that folder, ready to be exposed to the parents who worshipped him. He let out a desperate, choked gasp. Without thinking, he physically lunged forward, throwing his body across the glass desk, trying to grab the folder before anyone else could open it. His hands desperately clawed at the smooth surface, but he never even reached the thick red cardboard. Before his fingers could graze the file, the lead security guard moved with terrifying speed. The massive guard stepped forward and clamped a heavy hand firmly onto Trent's shoulder. With one powerful motion, the guard forcefully shoved my brother backward. Trent stumbled clumsily and crashed hard into the leather guest chair, completely losing his balance. He stayed pinned to the chair, breathing heavily, while the guard stood directly over him, silently daring him to try and move again. The entire room fell into a dead silence once more. My mother stared at the scene unfolding right before her. She could not comprehend why her perfect son was panicking. Instead of questioning his bizarre behavior, she immediately blamed the guard. "How dare you put your hands on my son?" she shrieked. She stepped forward, raising her purse as if to strike him. The second security guard simply raised a single warning hand, stopping her. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you step back and remain completely quiet." His voice was low, but it carried an absolute, undeniable authority. Patricia froze, realizing she was entirely powerless inside my corporate fortress. I watched Trent struggling to catch his breath in the leather chair. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his forehead was covered in sweat. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant man who slapped me yesterday. He looked like a terrified little boy who had finally been caught stealing. I slowly tapped my perfectly manicured fingernail against the red cardboard folder. The sharp clicking sound echoed through the massive corner office like a countdown. My father Richard finally spoke, his voice trembling with genuine deep fear. "Sloane, please tell us what is inside that file," he asked very weakly. He stared at the folder, knowing it held the absolute devastating truth. I did not answer him right away because I wanted them to suffer. I wanted them to feel the exact same suffocating anxiety they gave me. For decades, they had completely destroyed my self-esteem to protect his fragile ego. Now his ego was about to be permanently shattered into a million tiny pieces. I looked directly into Trent's panicked eyes and I smiled a cold, ruthless smile. "This is your entire life," I whispered, letting the absolute reality sink in deeply. "And it is over." I slowly opened the thick red folder and smoothed my hand over the first page of the massive printed report. My family had spent my entire life completely underestimating my intelligence and my capabilities. They thought I was just a basic clerk who filed tax returns for small local businesses. They had absolutely no idea what a senior forensic accountant actually does. My job is to track hidden money. I spend my days dismantling complex financial fraud, uncovering offshore accounts, and bringing white-collar criminals to absolute justice. When Trent stopped paying rent 6 months ago, I did not just look at his lease agreement. I decided to run a comprehensive forensic audit on his entire existence. I pulled his credit reports, his bank statements, and his massive tax filings. I meticulously tracked every single dollar that came into his possession and every single dollar that went out. I looked down at the neatly organized spreadsheets, and then I looked directly at my father Richard, who was still trembling in his leather house slippers. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice completely steady and utterly devoid of any emotion. "Do you remember when Trent bought that ridiculous sports car 3 years ago and told you he got a massive promotion at work?" Richard nodded slowly, his eyes darting nervously between me and the red folder. He swallowed hard, looking incredibly frail in the bright morning sunlight pouring through the massive windows. I turned the page of the report and tapped my finger against a highlighted column of numbers. "Trent never got a promotion," I stated clearly so my words would echo across the quiet room. "In fact, his company demoted him 3 years ago for severe financial incompetence and cut his salary in half. He has been living entirely on massive amounts of borrowed money ever since. But he did not just max out his own credit cards or take out standard personal loans. Because his credit was completely destroyed, he needed a much larger pool of clean money to steal from so he could keep buying expensive custom suits and flying first class to luxury resorts." I watched Trent squirm in his chair under the heavy hand of the security guard. He was sweating profusely and staring at the floor, completely unable to look our father in the eye. I pulled out a stack of legally binding loan documents from the red folder and spread them out across the smooth glass desk so everyone could clearly see the blue ink signatures at the bottom of every single page. I picked up the first document and held it up directly toward my father. "For the past 3 years, Trent has been actively forging your signature on massive high-interest loans," I explained calmly. He used your personal identification information and your pristine credit history to secretly borrow against your entire retirement fund. Every single time he needed money to impress his friends or buy another ridiculous luxury item, he simply filled out the paperwork digitally and faked your authorization. He drained your primary pension account first. When that was completely gone, he moved on to your secondary investment portfolios. He systematically liquidated everything you spent 40 years working for just to maintain his completely fake wealthy lifestyle. Richard stared at the blue ink signatures on the paper, and his face turned the color of ash. He let out a strange, high-pitched gasp that sounded like all the air had just been violently punched out of his lungs. He stumbled forward, clutching his chest with both of his shaking hands. The absolute horror of the realization washed over his face as he finally understood the true cost of his blind devotion to his golden child son. At 65 years old, my father was entirely bankrupted with absolutely zero savings left to his name. He did not just lose his luxury sport utility vehicle today. I continued ruthlessly driving the final nail into his financial coffin. He has lost his entire future. You have hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest debt attached directly to your Social Security number, Richard, and your perfect son is the one who put it there. Richard collapsed into the empty leather chair next to Trent, weeping uncontrollably into his hands. His entire body shook with the devastating grief of a man who had just lost his entire life's work. He finally saw Trent for the manipulative parasite he truly was. But my mother Patricia was completely incapable of accepting reality. She absolutely refused to believe that her perfect boy was a common thief. She rushed over to Trent and wrapped her arms protectively around his shoulders, glaring at me with pure, unhinged hatred. "You are making this up!" she screamed hysterically, her voice cracking under the intense pressure of the room. "My son would never steal from his own father. You fabricated these documents just to ruin him." I simply stared at her, watching her desperately try to glue her shattered delusion back together. When the undeniable truth of the forged signatures finally became too obvious for even her to ignore, she completely changed her strategy. She stopped denying the massive fraud and immediately started trying to excuse his criminal behavior. "He was under an enormous amount of pressure," she yelled, pointing a shaking manicured finger at my face. "He has a wife to support and a huge image to maintain in his corporate circle. He just needed a little bit of help to get through a rough patch. You are sitting here in this massive, beautiful office completely surrounded by ridiculous wealth. You own this entire building, Sloan, so you obviously have millions of dollars to spare. You can easily afford to pay off these stupid loans for him." I looked at her pathetic face, and I let out a loud, cold, ruthless laugh. My laughter echoed sharply against the thick glass walls, cutting right through her demands. The office door swung open. My cold laughter was suddenly cut short by the sound of the heavy glass office door swinging open. Everyone in the room turned their heads toward the entrance, expecting to see another security guard, or perhaps my executive assistant. Instead, Jasmine walked through the doorway. She did not look like the terrified, confused wife who had been standing in the grand foyer of my house just 2 hours ago. She had transformed completely. She was wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue trench coat over her clothes, and she carried a sleek leather designer briefcase. Her posture was incredibly straight, and her chin was held high, radiating an undeniable aura of power and absolute certainty. But the most striking detail was that she did not come alone. Flanked on her right side was a sharply dressed woman in a dark gray suit carrying a thick leather folio. It was instantly obvious to anyone with basic corporate experience that this woman was a high-powered attorney. Jasmine had not come to the financial district to support her husband or to join my mother's toxic crusade. She had come to the battlefield fully armed and ready to completely destroy the man who had lied to her since the day they met. Trent was still slumped in the leather guest chair, sweating heavily and panicking over the red folder resting on my desk. When he saw his beautiful wife walk into the room, his entire face lit up with a pathetic glimmer of false hope. He completely misunderstood her presence. His deeply ingrained arrogance convinced him that she was there to stand by his side and defend him against me. Trent practically jumped out of his chair, ignoring the massive security guard standing right behind him. He rushed toward Jasmine with tears streaming down his face. He reached out with both hands, desperately trying to grab her arms. "Jasmine, thank God you are here," he cried out, his voice cracking pitifully. "You have to help me talk some sense into my sister. She is completely out of her mind and she is trying to ruin my life over a stupid misunderstanding. Tell her she needs to stop this illegal eviction right now and forgive me." He was literally sobbing, begging his wife to fix the massive, catastrophic mess he had created through his own greed and financial fraud. He wanted her to be his shield just like our mother had always been. But Jasmine did not reach out to comfort him. She did not offer him a warm embrace or tell him that everything was going to be all right. In fact, she did not even acknowledge his physical presence. When Trent tried to grab her sleeves, she simply stepped smoothly to the side, completely avoiding his touch. Her movement was so fluid and coldly dismissive that Trent stumbled forward awkwardly, almost losing his balance again. Jasmine walked right past him without making eye contact. She completely ignored my mother Patricia, who was staring at the lawyer with wide, confused eyes. She ignored my father Richard, who was still weeping softly in the corner of the room. Jasmine walked straight across the polished concrete floor, her boot heels clicking with deliberate authority, until she reached the edge of my massive tempered glass desk. Trent spun around, completely bewildered by her absolute rejection. He stood in the middle of the room with his hands hovering in the empty air, completely unable to comprehend why his obedient wife was not rushing to his immediate rescue. Jasmine stopped right in front of my desk and looked down at me. For her entire relationship with Trent, she had been fed a constant toxic diet of lies about who I was. Trent had painted me as a jealous, broke loser who was constantly begging the family for money. My mother had described me as a bitter, lonely woman who lacked the ambition to ever succeed in the real world. But as Jasmine stood in my breathtaking corner office, looking at my tailored suit and the red forensic audit folder resting on the glass, she finally saw the absolute truth. She did not see a pathetic younger sister. She saw a highly successful corporate titan. She saw an intelligent, powerful woman who had quietly built a massive financial empire while enduring years of completely unwarranted abuse. She saw a true equal, a peer. Jasmine did not speak right away. She slowly extended her right hand across the desk toward me. I stood up from my leather ergonomic chair and met her hand. We shook hands firmly. It was a handshake built on deep mutual respect and a silent shared understanding of the massive betrayal we had both endured at the hands of the exact same man. After our firm handshake, Jasmine slowly withdrew her hand and took a deep breath. She turned her body around to finally face her husband. Trent was staring at her with his mouth hanging open, resembling a terrified animal caught in the headlights of an approaching truck. When Jasmine locked eyes with him, there was absolutely no love or warmth left in her expression. There was only pure, absolute disgust. She looked at him as if he were a completely repulsive stranger standing in the room. "Trent, you are a pathetic excuse for a man," she said, her voice dangerously low and steady, cutting through the tension like a razor blade. "You thought I was coming here to save you from your sister, but you are completely wrong. I am here to make sure you pay for every single lie you ever told me. You stole my savings and you destroyed my trust. Now I am going to take everything else that you have left to lose because you deserve nothing less than total destruction. Your perfect life was always a pathetic and complete illusion built on the pain of the women around you. Trent, I want a divorce immediately, you broke, fake, narcissistic little boy." The sharp corporate lawyer next to Jasmine did not waste a single second. She then stepped smoothly around the leather guest chair where my brother was currently sweating and trembling. The lawyer reached into her expensive leather folio and pulled out a thick stack of pristine white legal documents. With a swift and calculated motion, she dropped the heavy stack of papers directly onto the glass surface of my desk, right next to my red forensic audit folder. The loud slap of the thick paper hitting the tempered glass caused Trent to jump nervously. He stared blindly at the black letters printed across the top of the cover page. It was an expedited filing for an absolute divorce and a massive civil lawsuit for financial restitution. Trent looked up at his wife with eyes completely filled with raw panic and utter disbelief. He had always firmly believed that Jasmine would stay with him no matter what, because he thought his charm and his good looks could easily manipulate her out of any serious problem. He truly thought she would just go to her parents' house to calm down and let him fix the situation. But Jasmine was not a weak woman who would sit around waiting for a liar to change his terrible behavior. She was a brilliant architect who built strong foundations for a living, and she was currently tearing his entire foundation right down to the ground. Trent opened his mouth to speak, but Jasmine immediately raised her hand to silence him. Her posture was completely rigid, and her dark eyes were burning with a cold, unforgiving intensity. "Do not even try to speak right now, Trent," she commanded, her voice echoing with absolute authority across the quiet executive office. "You have spent our entire relationship feeding me a constant stream of garbage and lies, but I am officially done listening to your pathetic excuses." When the county sheriffs showed up at that house this morning to serve an emergency eviction notice, I did not just pack my suitcase and run away crying. I am a professional who looks at the fine print for a living. I spent my entire morning making phone calls, checking bank records, and doing my own deep digging into your financial history. I realized very quickly that the $50,000 you made me spend on that ridiculous gourmet kitchen renovation was just the absolute tip of the massive iceberg. You convinced me to drain my hard-earned premarital savings account to upgrade a house you secretly did not even own. You let me invest my money into a total lie while you played the role of the wealthy, successful husband. You watched me sign the checks for the marble countertops and the imported appliances, knowing full well that your sister actually owned the property and that you were 6 months behind on your secret rent payments. Trent started shaking his head back and forth violently, trying to deny the undeniable facts. "Jasmine, please, it was not like that at all," he whimpered, his voice cracking pathetically. "I was going to pay you back every dollar as soon as my annual bonus came through." Jasmine let out a sharp, humorless laugh that sounded incredibly loud in the tense room. "Your annual bonus," she repeated with pure sarcastic venom dripping from every single word. "You do not get an annual bonus, Trent, because you were completely demoted 3 years ago for being financially incompetent. You have absolutely no money and you have no power. But the worst part is not just the fake kitchen renovation or the fake promotions. The absolute worst part is what I found when my lawyer subpoenaed your private digital banking records an hour ago." Patricia gasped loudly from the corner of the room, clutching her pearls as if she was watching a terrifying movie. Jasmine turned her fierce gaze back to Trent, leaning slightly forward to deliver the ultimate devastating blow. "You did not just drain my savings account to pay for home improvements," Jasmine stated coldly. "You have been secretly funneling thousands of dollars of my money and the massive fraudulent loans you stole from your father into a hidden offshore trust account located in the Cayman Islands." The entire room seemed to instantly freeze as the sheer magnitude of his criminal actions settled over us. My father, Richard, let out another quiet sob, burying his face deeper into his hands. He realized his son was not just irresponsible, but intentionally malicious and deeply calculating. "You opened that offshore account exactly 3 months before our wedding day." Jasmine continued, her voice rising with righteous anger. "You were actively trying to hide those stolen assets from me, so they would not be included in our prenuptial agreement. You meticulously planned to defraud me from the very beginning. You are not just a terrible husband, Trent. You are a completely calculating criminal, and I am going to make absolutely sure that you spend a very long time sitting in a federal prison cell for what you have done to me and to your own father." Trent was completely paralyzed. The security guard standing behind him shifted his weight clearly, ready to physically restrain my brother if he tried to do anything foolish or violent. But Trent had absolutely no fight left in him. His fake wealthy world was completely collapsing around him, and there was absolutely no one left to protect him. His mother could not buy his way out of this disaster, and his father was completely bankrupted by his actions. Jasmine reached into the pocket of her tailored navy blue trench coat and pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. She held it up so the sunlight catching the metal made it shine brightly in the room. This drive contains all the routing numbers, the hidden offshore account details, and the digital transfer logs my lawyer managed to pull from your personal laptop this morning, she said, staring directly into his terrified eyes. Then Jasmine turned away from him and walked the final 2 steps right up to my desk. She completely ignored the panicked whimpers coming from her soon-to-be ex-husband. She placed the silver flash drive gently onto the glass surface, right next to my red forensic audit folder. She looked at me with a profound sense of mutual respect and unbreakable solidarity. "I know you are the chief executive officer of this massive firm," she said to me, her voice softening slightly but retaining its sharp edge. "But right now, I need the absolute best forensic accountant in the entire city to track every single dime he ever stole from me. I need you to completely dismantle his hidden accounts and hand the evidence over to the authorities." I looked down at the silver flash drive, and then I looked up into Jasmine's fierce, determined eyes. I reached out and picked up the drive, wrapping my fingers tightly around the cold metal. I leaned back in my leather chair and gave her a small, terrifyingly confident smile. "Consider it done, Jasmine," I replied smoothly without any hesitation. "He is all yours." The sudden finality of Jasmine's words completely broke whatever fragile restraint my mother still possessed. Patricia could not handle the fact that her golden child was being publicly abandoned by his successful wife. She threw her hands up into the air and let out a dramatic, hysterical gasp that echoed off the thick glass walls of my office. "Jasmine, you cannot simply abandon your family like this," Patricia shrieked, rushing forward to place herself between her panicked son and his incredibly calm wife. "Good wives stand by their men, through their little mistakes, and they do not just throw away a beautiful marriage over money." Patricia desperately tried to spin the narrative, trying to convince everyone in the room that Trent's massive financial crimes were nothing more than a small, temporary misunderstanding. She looked at Jasmine with wide, tear-filled eyes, deploying the exact same toxic manipulation tactics she had used on me for my entire life. She claimed that Trent was under too much pressure and that Jasmine was being overly dramatic and completely unreasonable for filing divorce papers so quickly. She demanded that Jasmine cancel the civil lawsuit immediately and forgive Trent because family always forgives. Patricia was completely convinced that she could shame Jasmine into staying. She believed that guilt and social pressure were the ultimate weapons because they had always worked perfectly on my father and on me when I was younger. She had always used tears and theatrical panic attacks to instantly silence any opposition or completely shut down any logical argument. When Trent failed out of his first university, she cried until Richard agreed to pay for a much more expensive private college to hide the public embarrassment. She thought those exact same dramatic emotional weapons would easily work against a highly educated architect who built her entire career on cold, hard facts. Jasmine saw the pathetic performance for exactly what it was, and she absolutely refused to play along with the long-standing toxic family delusion right here today. But Jasmine was absolutely not a scared child. She was an intelligent, highly successful architect who saw right through the pathetic facade. Jasmine did not step back or look down. She stood her ground and locked her sharp, dark eyes directly onto my mother. Jasmine slowly tilted her head and studied my mother as if she were examining a deeply flawed architectural blueprint. The room grew incredibly quiet as Jasmine's lethal intellect zeroed in on the true source of Trent's absolute failure. "Patricia, you have absolutely no right to lecture me about what a good wife should do," Jasmine stated with an icy calm that made my mother's frantic energy look entirely pathetic. "You have spent your entire life covering up for his massive mistakes and blaming everyone else for his obvious shortcomings. You taught him that he could do whatever he wanted without ever facing a single consequence because Mommy would always be there to clean up his mess. You are the exact reason he is sitting in that chair right now crying like a helpless child, instead of standing up and taking accountability like a real man. My mother gasped loudly, stepping back as if she had been physically struck. No one had ever spoken to her with such absolute blunt authority. Richard stopped crying for a brief moment and looked up entirely stunned by Jasmine's fearless confrontation. Trent tried to mumble a defense for his mother, but Jasmine immediately cut him off without even looking at him. "Keep your mouth shut, Trent," Jasmine commanded sharply. "I am talking to your mother now." Jasmine took one step closer to Patricia, forcing my mother to confront the harsh, undeniable reality of her toxic parenting. "You spent decades treating Sloane like she was a massive burden," Jasmine continued, her voice carrying a powerful, rhythmic cadence. "You broke your daughter's spirit just to build up your son's fragile ego. You constantly demanded that Sloane sacrifice her own happiness and her financial stability to protect a man who completely lacks basic integrity," Jasmine declared, pointing a firm finger toward the red forensic audit folder resting on my glass desk. "You watched him physically assault his sister last night, and instead of correcting him, you demanded that the victim apologize. You enabled his violent temper, his financial greed, and his endless pathetic lies. You thought you were protecting him from the harsh realities of the world, but you actually completely destroyed his ability to survive in it. You did not raise a strong, successful son, Patricia." Jasmine let the heavy silence stretch for a few seconds, allowing the absolute truth to sink deep into my mother's bones. "You raised a massive parasite," Jasmine delivered the final blow, her voice dripping with pure, unfiltered disgust. "And now that he has completely drained my savings account and bankrupted his own father, he has absolutely nowhere else to go. You created this monster, Patricia. You fed his delusions of grandeur, and you paid for his fake life with money you stole from your incredibly successful daughter. So now you get to take him back. You get to live with him, and you get to watch him face federal criminal charges, because I am completely done paying for his miserable existence." My mother began to shake violently. The carefully constructed mask of the perfect, wealthy suburban matriarch completely melted away, leaving nothing but a terrified, broken old woman. The absolute truth of Jasmine's words pierced through decades of profound denial. Patricia finally broke down completely. She burst into loud, dramatic tears, dropping to her knees right there on the polished concrete floor of my executive office. She wailed, covering her face with her hands, desperately hoping that her sudden display of extreme emotional agony would force someone to rush over and comfort her. She expected my father to run to her side. She expected Trent to defend her honor. She even expected Jasmine to soften and apologize for being so unbelievably harsh. But absolutely no one moved to help her. Richard just stared blankly at the wall, completely emotionally hollowed out by his own financial ruin. Trent remained slumped in the leather guest chair, completely paralyzed by his impending legal doom. I sat comfortably behind my desk, resting my hands on the glass surface, watching the incredibly satisfying collapse of the woman who had made my childhood a complete living nightmare. Jasmine simply adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase and looked down at my sobbing mother with total apathy. "Your tears do not work on me," Patricia Jasmine said quietly before turning her back on the pathetic scene. The absolute silence of the room, aside from my mother's theatrical sobbing, was the most powerful statement of all. The toxic enabler had finally lost her entire audience. The narrative she had fiercely protected for 35 years was permanently destroyed. There were no more lies left to tell, and absolutely no more victims left to manipulate. The family structure she had ruled with an iron fist was completely dismantled, and she was left crying on the floor entirely alone while the rest of us simply watched with cold, absolute indifference. Jasmine turned her back on the pathetic scene unfolding on my office floor and walked straight out the heavy glass doors without ever looking back. The sharp click of her designer boots faded down the long executive hallway, leaving behind a suffocating silence in my massive corner office. My mother, Patricia, was still weeping loudly on the floor, her face buried in her hands, completely shattered by the absolute destruction of her carefully maintained social facade. I let the heavy atmosphere settle over them for a few long moments, simply observing the absolute devastation they had brought entirely upon themselves. Then I slowly turned my head and looked at the beautiful antique grandfather clock standing elegantly in the corner of my office. The heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth, ticking with a steady rhythmic precision that echoed sharply in the quiet room. I looked back at Trent, who was still hyperventilating in the leather guest chair. His expensive custom-tailored suit was soaked in cold sweat, and his face was a pale, sickly shade of gray. He looked like a man who had just been sentenced to a lifetime of absolute misery. "Trent," I said, my voice slicing through my mother's dramatic sobbing with icy authority. "I strongly suggest you stop feeling sorry for yourself and start looking at the clock. You currently have exactly 45 minutes left on the emergency vacate order the county sheriffs handed you this morning." Trent blinked rapidly, looking at me with bloodshot eyes, completely unable to comprehend my sudden shift in focus. He was still drowning in the reality of his impending divorce and the massive federal fraud exposure, but I was absolutely not going to let him forget the immediate physical consequences of his actions. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool glass surface of my desk. "If you and your parents are not completely off my suburban property by the time that clock strikes 11, I have authorized my property manager to take extreme measures," I explained calmly. "I have a professional commercial junk removal crew currently parked at the very end of your street. They are sitting in a massive heavy-duty dump truck drinking their morning coffee and waiting for my direct signal. The second the sheriff officially declares you in violation of the vacate order, my crew will march through the front door and begin clearing out the entire estate." I watched Trent's eyes widen in sheer panic as I laid out the brutal reality of his situation. "They are not going to carefully pack your things into neat little cardboard boxes. Trent," I continued, my tone completely devoid of any sympathy, "they are going to take your expensive custom Italian suits, your ridiculously overpriced golf clubs, and all the fake luxury goods you bought with your stolen money, and they are going to throw them directly into a filthy metal dumpster. Everything you own will be completely trashed and hauled away to the city landfill by noon." The sheer image of his precious luxury items being tossed into the garbage finally snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity Trent was still holding on to. The terrified, broken little boy completely vanished and was instantly replaced by a rabid-cornered animal. Trent leaped out of the leather guest chair with terrifying speed. He completely ignored the massive security guard standing just a few feet away. He lunged forward and slammed both of his fists violently down onto the thick, tempered glass of my desk. The massive impact rattled the red forensic audit folder and sent a shockwave vibrating through the heavy desk frame. "You miserable, vindictive little witch!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unhinged rage. The veins in his neck and forehead were popping out against his flushed red skin. Spit flew from his mouth as he leaned over the desk, trying to physically intimidate me, just like he had done in the dining room the night before. "You think you can just take my house and my wife and destroy my entire life and get away with it?" he yelled, his eyes bulging with absolute fury. "I am going to sue you for everything you have ever built. I am going to drag you into civil court and sue you for severe emotional distress and massive financial fraud. I will tell the judge that you illegally manipulated those lease documents and forced me into default. I will sue you for public defamation and completely destroy your professional reputation in this city. You think you are so powerful because you sit in a fancy office, but I am going to tear this entire company down to the ground. I will make sure you lose your accounting license and end up rotting in a jail cell right next to me." He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving up and down as he continued to scream empty threats into my face. He was desperately trying to regain control by using the only weapon he had left, which was blind aggressive intimidation. My mother temporarily stopped crying and looked up from the floor, desperately hoping that Trent's aggressive outburst would somehow miraculously save them from the impending doom. I never flinched. I did not lean back in my chair, and I absolutely did not break eye contact with my raging brother. I sat perfectly still, watching him throw a massive, pathetic temper tantrum like a spoiled toddler who had finally been told no for the very first time in his miserable life. I let him completely exhaust himself, screaming until his voice was hoarse and his throat was raw. When he finally stopped to take a desperate, gasping breath, the office fell completely silent once again. The massive security guard stepped forward, reaching out to physically restrain my brother, but I simply raised a single finger to stop him. I wanted Trent to feel the full weight of his complete powerlessness. I looked at his sweaty face, smiling. Trent stood over my desk, panting heavily. The echoes of his screaming threats still bounced off the thick glass windows of my corner office. He had just threatened to sue me for severe emotional distress and massive financial fraud. He promised to completely destroy my company and my professional accounting license. He was completely out of breath, and his incredibly expensive custom Italian suit was entirely ruined by his own terrified sweat. He waited eagerly for me to react to his violent outburst. He fully expected me to flinch or show some clear sign of physical fear, because that is exactly what our mother Patricia had always trained me to do whenever he threw a massive temper tantrum. She always taught me to make myself smaller, so his fragile ego could feel much larger. But I did not shrink away from him today. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic, aggressive energy. Instead, I looked directly at his red-flushed face, and I smiled. It was not a warm or forgiving smile. It was a cold, terrifying smile that completely froze the remaining air in the room and signaled his absolute doom. I rested my hands flat on the polished glass surface of my desk and looked deeply into his panicked eyes. "I was really hoping you would say that, Trent," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that commanded absolute attention from everyone in the room. "I was truly hoping you would want to take this entire matter to a civil court. You see, when you file a civil lawsuit for financial fraud or public defamation, it opens up a massive legal process called discovery. During the discovery process, every single piece of your life is laid bare for the judge and the corporate lawyers to examine thoroughly. Every bank statement, every email, every hidden offshore account, and every forged signature suddenly becomes official public record. If you actually tried to sue me today, you would be doing all the hard work for me. You would be wrapping your own criminal history in a neat little bow and handing it directly to the federal government on a silver platter." Trent stared at me, his chest heaving as the aggressive fire in his eyes rapidly began to extinguish. He suddenly realized that his empty threats of civil lawsuits were absolutely meaningless against a senior forensic accountant who already held every single piece of his complex financial puzzle. I did not just stumble upon his massive web of lies by accident. I had spent weeks meticulously dismantling his entire life. I had tracked his offshore transfers and his forged retirement loans long before his wife Jasmine ever found out about the fake kitchen renovation. I knew exactly how deep his severe financial crimes went because it was my specific corporate job to find stolen money and bring white-collar criminals to absolute justice. He thought he was dealing with a jealous, broke little sister, but he was actually dealing with an apex predator in the financial world. He had walked right into a trap that he could never escape. "You do not seem to understand the sheer magnitude of the corner you have painted yourself into, Trent." I continued, keeping my voice perfectly steady and ruthlessly calm. "You are not going to civil court to fight over a suburban house or a bruised ego. You are going to face a much higher authority today." I did not break eye contact with him as I slowly reached my right hand across the massive desk toward the sleek black intercom system resting near my computer monitor. I extended my index finger and pressed a single silver button. The soft electronic chime of the intercom echoed clearly through the massive office, cutting through the heavy silence. Almost instantly, the heavy wooden door connecting my private office to the adjoining executive conference room clicked unlocked. The door swung open slowly, revealing the bright fluorescent lights of the meeting room next door. Everyone in my office turned their heads to look at the doorway. Patricia stopped her dramatic sniffing, and Richard looked up from his trembling hands. Trent completely froze, his body going rigid as he watched two individuals step out of the conference room and walk purposefully into my office. They were not wearing the standard dark uniforms of the local county sheriff deputies who had visited his house earlier that morning. They were two tall men wearing plain tailored suits with completely unreadable expressions on their faces. They moved with a quiet, terrifying authority that instantly commanded the entire room. The first man stepped forward and reached into the inside pocket of his dark suit jacket. He pulled out a small black leather wallet and flipped it open to reveal a shining gold federal shield. "Good morning," the man said, his voice echoing with absolute undeniable power. "We are special agents with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division." The spoken words struck Trent like a physical blow to the stomach. The county sheriffs were just there to enforce a basic civil eviction, but the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division was an entirely different and inescapable nightmare. They did not care about family drama or bruised egos. They only cared about massive tax evasion and severe wire fraud. Trent stumbled backward away from my desk until the back of his knees hit the leather guest chair. He collapsed into the seat, completely unable to support his own body weight anymore. He looked back and forth between the two federal agents and me, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound at all. I looked down at the small silver flash drive that Jasmine had placed on my desk just a few minutes earlier. I picked it up and held it firmly between my fingers so Trent could see it clearly reflecting the morning light. "Jasmine brought me this drive today to help track your stolen assets," I explained casually, as if we were discussing the weather. But she did not realize that I already had all of this exact same information securely stored. "You see, Trent? I did not just print out that thick red folder for my own personal amusement today. I compiled a comprehensive digital copy of your entire fraudulent history, including the forged loans from our father and the hidden offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands." I paused deliberately, letting the absolute terror wash over him completely and permanently. "And I submitted that entire digital portfolio directly to the Internal Revenue Service exactly 1 week ago," I revealed, watching his entire fabricated world shatter into a million tiny pieces. "These special agents have been sitting in my adjoining conference room for the past 2 hours, reviewing the final wire transfer logs, and patiently waiting for you to arrive. You honestly thought you were driving downtown to humiliate me and get me fired from my miserable junior job. But I actually lured you here so the federal government could take you into formal custody without making a massive public scene at my suburban property." The second federal agent stepped forward and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his leather belt. "Trent, you are being detained for immediate questioning regarding multiple felony counts of severe tax evasion, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft," the agent stated clearly, reading the official federal charges aloud for the whole room to hear. "Please stand up and place your hands directly behind your back right now." Trent did not fight back at all. He did not scream or threaten to sue anyone ever again. The absolute reality of federal prison completely crushed whatever remaining spirit he had left inside him. He slowly stood up, his entire body trembling violently under the weight of his own terrible choices. He placed his hands behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of the heavy handcuffs echoing through the office sounded like a massive steel vault door slamming shut on his life forever. My mother Patricia watched in pure, unfiltered horror as her precious golden child was physically restrained by federal agents. She simply could not process what was happening right in front of her eyes. She tried to step forward to protect him, but her weak legs gave out completely. She slumped against the painted wall, sobbing uncontrollably, realizing that she could absolutely never manipulate or buy his way out of federal tax evasion charges. My father, Richard, simply stared at the polished concrete floor, completely numb to the entire devastating situation. His retirement fund was completely gone, his luxury car was repossessed, and now his only son was being hauled away in steel handcuffs. The federal agents securely gripped Trent by his arms and began walking him toward the heavy glass doors of my office. As they guided him slowly past my desk, Trent finally looked up at me for the very last time. His eyes were completely hollow and entirely devoid of the arrogant pride he had worn just last night at the Thanksgiving dinner table. He looked like a completely broken man who finally understood that his entire life was a pathetic illusion. I did not offer him any words of comfort, and I did not say goodbye. I simply sat in my incredibly expensive leather chair inside the massive corporate building I owned and watched the federal agents escort my violent, abusive brother out of my life forever. The foolish threat he made to destroy my firm had completely backfired, and now he was the one facing absolute and total destruction. The heavy steel doors of the private executive elevator closed behind them, securing my completely shattered family inside the small metal box, along with the two federal agents. I did not ride down with them. Instead, I walked over to the massive bank of security monitors mounted on my office wall. I had full camera access to every single floor of my building, and I specifically pulled up the high-definition feed for the main floor grand lobby. I wanted to watch exactly how this ended. Inside the elevator, the atmosphere was completely suffocating. Trent stood with his hands locked tightly behind his back in heavy federal handcuffs, staring blankly at the polished steel doors. He looked completely dead inside. My mother Patricia was leaning heavily against the back wall, sobbing so violently that her expensive makeup was completely ruined, running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. My father Richard stood silently beside her, holding his chest and crying softly over his completely evaporated retirement fund. They were descending rapidly from the highest peak of my corporate empire, straight down to their absolute rock bottom. They thought the worst part of their day was the federal arrest itself, but they had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them on the ground floor. Down in the massive marble lobby of my corporate headquarters, a very specific group of women had just arrived. These were not my corporate clients or my business partners. They were the senior organizing committee for the absolute most exclusive country club in the entire state. My mother had spent the last 10 years sacrificing her dignity, my father's finances, and my emotional well-being just to impress these exact women. She desperately wanted to be accepted as their equal. She had lied to them, constantly boasting that Trent was a massive billionaire executive who owned a sprawling suburban estate and flew on private jets. She told them I was just a sad, lonely secretary. The committee was actually visiting my building today because my corporate holding company was the primary financial sponsor for their upcoming annual charity gala. They were dressed in impeccable designer suits, holding expensive leather handbags, and waiting near the front reception desk for my event coordinator to escort them up to a meeting room. There were 5 women in total, led by the club president, a very wealthy and incredibly judgmental woman. They were chatting politely, completely unaware that the perfect wealthy family my mother had bragged about for a decade was currently plunging down the elevator shaft directly toward them. The private executive elevator reached the ground floor and chimed softly, echoing across the vast open space of the marble lobby. The polished steel doors slid open, and the 2 federal agents immediately stepped out, gripping Trent firmly by his arms. The country club women turned their heads toward the sound of the elevator, casually expecting to see my corporate event coordinator. Instead, they saw a completely terrifying and chaotic scene unfolding right in front of their eyes. The club president dropped her expensive leather handbag right onto the marble floor. The heavy thud echoed sharply, but nobody moved to pick it up. The 5 elite women stood in absolute shocked silence as they instantly recognized the young man being perp walked through the lobby in federal handcuffs. It was the same golden boy they had seen in hundreds of perfectly filtered holiday photographs. Right behind him, my mother stumbled out of the elevator. When Patricia looked up through her tear-soaked eyelashes and saw the 5 women standing by the reception desk, her entire body completely froze. The sheer visceral horror that washed over her face was absolutely indescribable. This was her ultimate nightmare manifesting in real time. The incredibly fragile social facade she had violently protected for her entire life was entirely exposed under the bright recessed lighting of the corporate lobby. Patricia let out a blood-curdling hysterical scream that genuinely startled the federal agents. No, do not look at us, she shrieked, throwing her hands up to cover her completely ruined face. She tried to turn around and run back into the elevator, but the doors had already closed behind her. She was trapped in the middle of the lobby, entirely exposed to the brutal judgment of the only people she ever cared about impressing. Trent lowered his head, trying to hide his face from the elite women, but there was absolutely nowhere to hide. To make the complete disaster even worse, my father Richard finally completely broke down in front of everyone. The sheer stress of the morning caused him to completely abandon his quiet, cowardly nature. He fell to his knees on the cold marble floor, right in front of the country club committee, weeping loudly. "He stole everything from me," Richard wailed, pointing a shaking finger at his handcuffed son. "My entire retirement fund is gone, and my luxury car is gone. He forged my signature and left me completely bankrupt at 65 years old." The country club women gasped, collectively taking physical steps backward to distance themselves from the incredibly toxic display of total financial ruin and criminal behavior. The club president raised her hand to cover her mouth, completely disgusted by the pathetic scene playing out before her. Patricia continued to scream frantically, begging the women to believe it was all just a terrible mistake, but they simply turned their backs and walked rapidly toward the exit, completely ignoring her desperate pleas. From the high-definition security monitors in my top-floor office, I watched the entire social execution unfold with absolute cold satisfaction. The fake billionaire was being hauled away to a federal holding cell. The enabling mother was completely stripped of her social standing and permanently humiliated. The cowardly father was publicly sobbing over his absolute bankruptcy. The perfect wealthy American family had officially shattered permanently, and they were finally getting exactly what they had always truly deserved. 6 months have passed since federal agents escorted my brother out of my corporate office. The changing seasons brought a completely new reality for everyone involved. The severe fraud and tax evasion charges moved swiftly through the justice system, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Trent is currently living in an incredibly cheap motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. He spends his days working at a local car wash, scrubbing the exact same types of luxury vehicles he used to pretend he owned. He is completely miserable and entirely alone, awaiting his upcoming federal criminal court trial date. The harsh reality of my brother's criminal actions completely destroyed whatever was left of my parents' fabricated social standing. My mother Patricia and my father Richard were permanently exiled from their elite country club. The women my mother spent decades trying to impress completely cut all ties, refusing to even acknowledge her presence in public. Because Richard lost his entire retirement fund to my brother's forged loans, they were forced to rapidly sell all of their remaining assets just to survive. They auctioned off their jewelry, their furniture, and their expensive clothes, moving into a cramped rental apartment downtown today. Without their money or their social status, my parents were finally forced to face the incredibly toxic reality they had created. They had no golden child left to worship, and absolutely no one left to manipulate. Earlier this week, I opened my laptop and saw a desperate email sitting in my personal inbox. It was from my mother. The subject line begged for forgiveness and asked for an immediate financial loan to help pay for my father's new medical bills. She tried to use guilt and family loyalty to pull me back into her miserable web of endless emotional manipulation. 10 years ago, I would have read that email and immediately felt a massive surge of guilt. I would have rushed to transfer thousands of dollars into their bank account, desperately hoping that my financial support would finally earn their love and respect. But sitting in my quiet office, I felt absolutely nothing for them. I did not open the message to read her pathetic excuses or her desperate pleas. I simply selected the message and permanently deleted it without a second of hesitation. Protecting my peace was far more valuable than carrying the burden of their endless, lifelong failures. The ultimate closure of my past allowed me to fully embrace my present life. I did not sell the massive suburban estate where my brother had assaulted me on Thanksgiving. Instead, I took it back completely and transformed it into a genuine sanctuary. I hired the best contractors in the city to gut the entire interior and erase every single trace of his fake, luxurious lifestyle. I replaced the dark, heavy mahogany furniture with bright modern pieces that reflected my own personal style. The house no longer felt like a suffocating museum of lies, but a warm, highly inviting home. Tonight, the beautifully renovated estate was filled with the rich sounds of genuine laughter and soft music. I was hosting a large dinner party, but the guest list was completely different from the terrible holiday gathering 6 months ago. There were no toxic relatives making passive-aggressive comments, and there was no tension hanging heavily in the air. The dining room was filled with people who actually loved and supported me unconditionally. This was my chosen family, consisting of loyal friends, dedicated colleagues, and mentors who had encouraged my incredible professional growth over the last 10 highly successful consecutive years. Sitting directly across from me at the massive dining table was Jasmine. She looked absolutely radiant and completely unburdened by the terrible weight of her previous marriage. Her divorce from Trent was finalized rapidly, and she managed to completely recover all of the money he had stolen from her savings account. But Jasmine was no longer just my former sister-in-law. After she hired me to track his hidden offshore assets, we realized that our professional skills were a perfect match. Jasmine is now my closest personal friend and my primary business partner in a highly lucrative new venture. We recently launched a highly successful real estate development firm, combining my advanced forensic accounting skills with her brilliant architectural vision. We specialize in acquiring undervalued commercial properties and transforming them into beautiful community spaces. Working alongside her has been the most rewarding experience of my entire career. She is incredibly sharp, fiercely loyal, and completely immune to the kind of toxic manipulation we both survived. As the dinner party guests enjoyed their expensive wine and delicious food, Jasmine caught my eye across the table and smiled, raising her crystal glass toward me in a silent, profoundly meaningful emotional tribute. I smiled back and raised my own glass to meet hers. I stood up from my chair and the entire room quieted down to listen. I did not give a long, dramatic speech about the terrible things we had overcome or the family members who had betrayed us. They did not deserve any more of our valuable time or energy. Instead, I looked around the room at the beautiful faces of my chosen family, and I simply proposed a toast to our incredibly bright future. I spoke about the absolute necessity of firmly enforcing ironclad personal boundaries forever today. I raised my glass higher, celebrating the sweet and undeniable beauty of walking away from toxicity to build an empire of our own. The guests cheered enthusiastically, their voices filling my beautiful home with pure joy and authentic love. As I took a sip of my expensive wine, I felt a profound sense of absolute freedom wash over my entire soul. I was no longer the invisible scapegoat or the struggling little sister. I was a powerful, wealthy, independent woman who had finally learned that true family is never defined by blood, but by unconditional love and mutual human respect. The most profound lesson we can take away from this entire story is that your biological family does not automatically dictate your personal worth. For decades, Sloane was treated like an invisible burden, while her toxic brother was praised for his massive financial lies. When you are constantly placed in the role of the family scapegoat, it becomes incredibly easy to internalize their abuse and believe that you somehow deserve their cruelty. But Sloane proved that true power comes from recognizing your own immense value and quietly building a life that completely contradicts their deeply flawed and extremely negative opinions. Establishing ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty or selfishness, it is an absolute act of survival. When Sloane finally cut off the financial support to her manipulative parents and evicted her abusive brother, she was not seeking petty revenge. She was simply allowing them to face the natural consequences of their own terrible actions. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. Choosing to walk away from emotional manipulation creates the necessary space to cultivate a beautiful chosen family based on mutual respect and genuine, unwavering, unconditional human emotional love. Have you ever found yourself forced to draw a difficult line with a toxic family member who constantly took your kindness for granted. I would absolutely love to hear your personal stories of incredible resilience and strength down in the comments section below. If Sloane's journey of taking back her power resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories. Do not forget to share this video with anyone who might need a strong reminder that walking away from abuse is the first step toward building a beautiful new personal empire.